All right. So now let's discuss what we mean by variants of the New Testament. Variant readings of a particular verse or passage, etc. So it's well known that there's this number's quoted a lot, that there are 300,000 individual variations when you look at them all throughout the different manuscripts and add them up of the New Testament. But keep in mind that this is because there's so many thousands of manuscripts, and of course you're going to have spelling errors, inverted phrases, and things like that are going to appear in those texts just from accidental copying errors. But those are easy to cite and rectify. So the vast majority of those 300,000 individual variations are of that kind of thing. So it's not like they're intentional changes on the whole, by no means. They're just spelling errors and that kind of thing. It doesn't, that's the vast majority. So that number doesn't bring into doubt the New Testament at all. It just is a testimony to the fact that we have so much out there to work with. So it's a good thing, not a bad thing. And also keep in mind that these copyists who might be copying from a copy, if there's an error in there, they're not taking it upon themselves to correct it. And that's just good practice, so you don't, get into a habit of doing that all the time, and then taking things into your own hands and maybe adding something to the text that you didn't mean to. It's better just to leave it alone and copy what you see and let it work itself out over time. And that's what's happened. So again, it's a testimony to the fact that these guys were careful, and if they were copying from an error, they kept the error in there on purpose to minimize further error. So I think that's a testimony to the careful nature of the copyists and the volume of manuscripts that we have. So it just reflects that this is actually amazingly preserved. And it's easy to spot most of these errors, and they're never in the same. You may have a error over here in one verse, an error over there in another, but you're not having. You'll have another manuscript that you're able to tell where the error was and correct it. So here's some of the types of variants that people have, that scholars have come across. First of all, there's variants that are by nature unintentional changes. So you can categorize these things into, we'll start with errors of sight. This is where the scribe may have been reading incorrectly. Again, these are easily elucidated and accounted for and are not really issues at all. And this is a lot of what is out there in that 300,000 number. So you might have a confusion of similar letters. Here's an example. In 1 Corinthians 5:8, the word for evil is porneros. And it's easily confused with porneas, which means sexual immorality. And so most manuscripts say porneas, pornoros, evil, while some, just a few, say the sexual immorality. But the word should be evil instead. But you can see those are a confusion of similar letters, and but they both kind of make sense in this sentence. Because it's kind of a variant of each other. So you can see where a mistake might be made, but you can compare the vast majority and look at the best manuscripts, the most reliable ones, and go with the meaning there. Then you have where there's words of similar, or phrase of similar ending. So omissions caused by similar endings of words and phrases. So Luke 12:8 and 9. We're looking at verses 8 and verses 9 compared to each other. Both verses end in before the angels of God. So it's easy to finish writing this at the end of verse 8, then look back to the original and see it at the end of verse 9, and you think you're still looking at verse 8. And so you move on to verse 10 and never put verse 9 in by accident because both verse 8 and verse 9 have the same ending. And your eyes skipped over verse 9 and moved on to verse 10. So you've got a copy out there that left out Luke 12:9. But that's a clear scribal error. So you know Luke 12:9 exists because it's there in all the other variants and all the other manuscripts. So yes, that's a variant, okay? But get past it because it's obviously a mistake made by the copyist. And this kind of stuff happens all the time, and we know when it happens in other writings of our own. Think of all the times you've done stuff like this. You've got the same thing by similar beginning. You got similar ending, you got similar beginning. The same kind of variants are out there of that kind of thing. And there's haplography, single writing once what should be written twice. Maybe there's a word or letter. A word itself should be written twice, or a letter should be, and you skipped over it. You wrote it once and you should have wrote it twice. And then there's didography, you're writing twice when you should have written once, because the word appears twice in a phrase, or you think it should. By accident, you put it in twice. Sometimes you can transposition words or phrases, but that becomes obvious too when it happens, because these guys are maybe translating or copying too fast and switch words by accident. More unintentional changes, errors of writing, similar to various errors of sight, but it's in the writing. Here we said errors of sight from reading incorrectly. Over here, errors of writing as you write, not as you see. So a lot of those same kind of errors appear that way. Now sometimes you had a leader who's a guy at the front of a bunch of scribes when they're trying to make a bunch of copies of these things in a scribal school, or later on when they're trying to build up the copies after the Diocletian persecution, for example. So you may have a whole classroom of guys that are writing, and one guy's reading the best exemplar that they have, and the rest of them are writing 15 copies, and there's 15 scribes out there, so they're hearing it. They're not reading it or not reading it themselves. They're hearing it in writing. So certain words then can be pronounced alike, and the guy gets confused. So like in Revelation 1:5, some manuscripts say washed us, and in the Greek that's lusanti, and that's you find that in the KJV. Some say freed us. That's also a very similar word, lusanti. So the lausanti maybe so washed us maybe lausanti, and freed us lusanti. They sound alike. The oldest, best manuscripts, which were not mass-produced, which we know were obviously not mass-produced, they have freed us. That's the one to go with, because the mass-produced one probably heard that wrong, and the guy that was reading it got it right. So there's an example where the KJV is not the best one, and that's not the best translation in that circumstance. That's kind of bad to be a KJV only person or a anything only person. You really got to look at the whole evidence and keep working back to the original. You may have a guy who's trying to remember, who thought he remembered something well, so that's errors of memory. He thinks he remembers something and he puts it in there, and really he's wrong. Sometimes you can't trust your memory. And then you got errors of judgment. You might have a guy that includes a marginal note into the text. So John 5:4, an example, where the earliest manuscripts and the best manuscripts don't have it in there. So it may not be original, it may be a marginal note that appeared in the text that was transmitted into the text by accident. But it was just a note in somebody's copy that they made to themselves. Now, here we come to intentional changes. I don't think this is nearly as widespread. It wasn't a widespread practice, and it may happen over here in one manuscript when all the other manuscripts have a different thing and you go with the others. Happen over there, but it's not like it's a conspiracy or a widespread intentional process. Maybe one little scribe, thought he had, here and there you're going to have people who break the rules, but you can tell who they are, and you can tell when it happened. So one guy may think, well, this is not grammatically correct, so I'm going to make a change grammatically. Some guy may say, well, this needs to be said a certain way in the reading of the text in a church. Some make a liturgical change. Some said, well, this is kind of, I see a discrepancy here and I want to clean it up. So he tries to clean it up. Others may try to harmonize what they know the other gospel said and trying to make sure it matches well with the, make sure all three gospels of the, let's say the synoptics are all saying the same thing. But again, this is like one or two guys doing it over here on this part of the text, one or two guys over there, and you can tell they're doing it, and you kind of toss them out, and you don't consider it as the final text. You have conflation where you're combining two kind of variants into one to try to clean up the two. You kind of know of two variants, and you're trying to make it one. And you can tell when a guy does that. He knew there were the two variants out there, and he wanted to make it clean. And said, well, I'll just combine a little bit of this and a little bit of that, make my own version. You have some would attempt to correct what is perceived a manuscript error. So in Mark 1:2 it says in the prophets in the KJV, and in the NRSV it says in the prophet Isaiah. So there's more manuscript evidence for the KJV, I believe, because I think it looks like the guy writing in the prophet Isaiah was trying to clarify. It wasn't really the prophets plural. We know it's coming from Isaiah, so I'm going to throw the name Isaiah in there. So that's probably the one to go with. In the prophets is the one to go with, probably the original one. And somebody tried to clean it up later and throw in Isaiah's name. And then here's an example of a doctrinal change. I think these are fewer and far between, but this is clearly what happened here in Matthew 24:36. The KJV does not have what we know should be there, and where it's talking about who knows the day or the hour of the Son's return of Jesus Christ coming back. It says, no one knows except the Father, not even the Son, nor the Son. And that's in the earliest, best manuscripts, nor the Son. But it looks like a manuscript that the KJV was based on, the guy didn't like nor the Son. He thinks, well, I think Jesus is God, so I think he should know everything, and therefore I'm going to leave out nor the Son. So the KJV leaves out nor the Son because it's based on a manuscript that left it out. But there's also good doctrinal reason to believe that Christ was in his early form, maybe even now. He's subject to the Father. Yes, he is God, but he's in the person of the Son. He is the Son. That's his person, and he's limited in some ways in that person, and so he would not know certain things if the Father chose to limit him there. So that's its own subject matter. But I think that's a better doctrine than what this person with good intention tried to do, to leave out nor the Son. But so many other manuscripts have it that are early. You know it belongs, and it's not a big deal. So there's some example of what we mean by variants. But after you compare, at the end of the day, if you compare all these variants to each other and overlap and take the best manuscripts, and you can tell kind of one outlier here and one outlier there, the result is that 95% of the original text can be known, and the other 5% don't affect any area of cardinal Christian doctrine. And these are variants, and it can usually be easily spotted, and you can usually get down to the original wording easily in most cases. And so, like in matters of true doctrine, all early, especially early, we gotta, you're going to go with the early if there's any question, usually over the late. So all early manuscripts agree. Like, for example, every single one of the early manuscripts of the Greek text of John 1:1 say the same thing in literal translation. I'm translating this like literally, word for word in the Greek, where the Word is Christ. In the beginning was the Word, Christ, and the Word was face to face with God, and God was the Word. So Christ, it's saying that Christ is God, and every single early manuscripts of John 1:1 says that. So there's a cardinal Christian doctrine that is not compromised in the variants. So currently, I think this is the most current editions since I made these slides, it's possible that they have even a more current version, but right now I think this is right. The current majority consensus Greek text is now found in two works of scholars. The one is the Nestle Aland Novum Testamentum Graeci, Greek, now in its 27th edition, NA 27, unless it's in its 28th, and it escaped my notice. And then you got the United Bible Society, the Greek New Testament, in its 4th edition. And both of those are the current, what they believe is the closest they can get to the original Greek text. And from these, the best translation, you make translations into other languages, such as English. But whatever language you're going to translate into, you're going to base it off of what they've come up with by comparing all this, using all this textual criticism and comparing all these variants to each other. You got the Nestle Aland 27 and the UBS, United Bible Society's Greek New Testament, in its 4th edition. And those are reliable. That's the true New Testament. That's as close as we can get to the original, right there in the original language, Greek. They're the latest and best in textual scholarship. So here are a few examples of some unresolved issues that I got from one of the books I'm using. So Luke 8:43. Some manuscripts have, having spent all her living on physicians, and it's not even that in Luke. We know that that's said in Mark 5:26. But it looks like maybe there's some manuscripts that have that phrase, having spent all her living on physicians, borrowed from Mark 5:26 and put into Luke in one of those efforts of harmonization or memory, where the guy remembers that in Mark and he throws it into Luke as he's writing it. And they haven't resolved it, but like in the main English text of the New American Standard Bible, they don't have that phrase in Luke 8:43, but some other translations of the New Testament into English do have it. But it probably doesn't belong because Luke was a physician. He's probably not going to put down, he's going to probably, as he's writing his text, have a little bit of a bias, pro-physician, and not bring up the fact that this sick lady had spent everything she had and gotten nowhere with physicians. That's probably not something Luke would have included, but Mark probably had no problem including that. Either way, that's a fact because Mark puts it in there. So it's just an added fact in Luke. Did Luke really say it? Well, probably not. But it doesn't screw anything up. That's not a issue of cardinal Christian doctrine, etc. I mean, there's not any real reason to have a conspiracy of including that in Luke 8. I mean, it's not a big deal. And that's how most of these variants go. Another example is Matthew 5:28. Consider omitting with her based on the earliest textual evidence. So go read Matthew 5:28. Either include it all and include the phrase with her, or don't include with her. Does it really change the overall meaning of Matthew 5:28? You tell me. Answer is going to be no. Let's look at Matthew 13:35. Consider omitting of the world after the foundation, or maybe of the world was added later on. Does it really matter? I mean, it doesn't really affect the meaning. Another, John 9:4, maybe instead of sent me, maybe sent us, based on the earliest manuscript evidence. Check your Bible. Which one does it say? Well, maybe change it to sent us. I mean, does that really make a big difference? John 10:29. Should it be worded this way in the Greek? That which my Father has given me is greater than all. Or should it be worded this way in the Greek? My Father who has given them to me is greater than all. So it does kind of change the meaning a little bit, but overall it's about the same, saying about the same thing. But just the construct of the Greek and how the words may be transpositioned, you're not sure which way it's the best reading based on the manuscript evidence. But it really doesn't make a hill of beans difference. And it's not going to hurt anything. Just take it both ways. Yeah, it's not really controversial. We do have a couple areas that are controversial. What to do with the ending of Mark. Mark 16:9 through 20 seems to be a later addition to Mark, but It also seems to be early as well, still. So it probably belongs. And it may have been a leaf that was lost from an original copy that was made, and they just kept on copying it without 9 through 20. Then it appeared in another copy, and those guys kept it in. And it depends on which tradition of copying you got, which scribe's being so careful not to include 9 through 20 when he may even think that it should belong. He just wants his line to preserve what he was given. So there can be debate there, but I think Mark 16, 9 through 20 belongs. And then John 8, 1 through 11, that's the adulterous woman. He who is without sin cast the first stone. I mentioned it in one of the other two presentations we've done already. It probably belongs. It may have been in a second release of John. It may have been another writing of John that somebody threw in one of the earlier copies of John and just tried to find a place for it. Either way, it probably is a real event, and it probably is intended to be there, but it does look a little bit out of place when you read the end of John chapter 7 and compare it to John 8:12. It looks like the end of John chapter 7 and John 8:12 lining right up with each other, and 8, 1 through 11 kind of shoved in there. It doesn't really matter, though. 8, 1, 11 probably belongs, but there's debate as to when and where that got in there. Here's the most important note, though, that I've said before. I'm going to say it again. The early New Testament papyri have virtually no new substantial variants when compared to the later papyri and codexes. That is so important. You have the same variants early as you do late. That suggests, look, there's not new variants showing up later in time. These guys were so good at preserving the variants that they didn't introduce any new ones. That suggests that all the New Testament variants are preserved somewhere in the extant manuscript tradition, like there's no other variants out there that we're missing. So one of those variants is the true reading of any given text that's open to debate, any given phrase or those kind of examples I showed. One of them's right, okay? It's not like there's something out there that's lost and who knows what happened. It got burned up because somebody didn't like it, and it was kind of controversial. We're going to burn this up because we want to keep it orthodox. I mean, that's not the case. All these variants are just they're not like a grand conspiracy. They're accidental here and there. There's no rhyme or reason, and they're random, And so the randomness and the lack of rhyme or reason suggests pure accidental issues on any given individual scribe's part. And so the fact that there's the same types of variants early as late suggests that you're seeing somewhere of any given variant. You may have 4 different variants of a passage, but one of those is the true. And so it's all out there in front of your face. You just got to pick which one. But there's nothing hidden. There's nothing lost. So nothing's lost. It's out there. We just have to decide which one's the best reading. So there's absolutely no shred of evidence for a widespread intentional tampering with the text. It's an absurd claim made by many Muslims and other critics. But it has no place. It's not scholarly. So that's the main thing to bring up. I'll probably leave it at that, and we'll discuss the New Testament canon next to keep this one a little shorter. All right.